John, I need those financial reports on my desk by noon, barked Mr. Anderson, his voice booming across the open-plan office. The entire team froze for a moment, their heads lowering as if by instinct. The air always grew tense when Anderson spoke, his sharp tone slicing through the hum of work. John sat at his desk, face tightening as he nodded without looking up. "I'm on it, sir," John replied, fingers clacking against his keyboard as he worked through the latest set of numbers for the quarterly report. "And for God's sake, get it right this time. I don't have time to babysit you through every line of this budget," Anderson added, rolling his eyes dramatically. He straightened his tailored suit, turning to leave but stopping short when he noticed Rachel, the project lead, walking over with a folder in hand. "Mr. Anderson," Rachel began, her voice calm but firm, "I wanted to discuss the updated timeline for the Raisin Tech project. We're running into some delays with the design team, and I think we might need to reevaluate." "I don't want to hear excuses, Rachel," Anderson interrupted, his tone dripping with impatience. "This project is costing the company $800,000. I expect results, not delays. Are you going to get it done or not?" Rachel clenched her jaw but kept her composure. "We're doing everything we can, but..." "No buts, Rachel," Anderson snapped. "You've been in this company long enough to know that I don't tolerate incompetence. If you can't handle it, I'll find someone who can." John exchanged a quick glance with Rachel, who gave him a small, knowing smile. She had worked under Anderson's thumb long enough to know when to back off. But John, who had only been at the company for 3 years, still felt the sting of every insult. He sighed, adjusting his glasses as Anderson finally stormed off to his office, the door slamming behind him. "That man is insufferable," Rachel whispered, sinking into the chair beside John's desk. "He has no idea what it takes to actually make a project work. He just barks orders and expects everything to magically fall into place." John leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Yeah, well, he seems to think his way is the only way. He doesn't even understand half the technical details of this project. If we screw something up, guess who he'll blame first?" Rachel smirked. "Oh, we already know the answer to that. It's always someone else's fault." Just as Rachel began to stand, Anderson's voice blared through the office once more. "John, I need you in my office. Now." John's face paled. "What did I do this time?" he muttered, getting up and walking toward the lion's den. As John entered Anderson's office, the tension in the room felt suffocating. Anderson sat behind his desk, his fingers steepled in front of him as he glared across the table. His expression was cold, calculating. "John, do you know who I am?" Anderson asked, his voice eerily calm. John blinked, momentarily thrown by the question. "Ah. You're Mr. Anderson. My boss." Anderson scoffed, leaning forward. "I'm more than your boss, John. I'm the one who built this company from the ground up. I'm the one who makes sure that every single person in this building gets paid. Do you understand that?" "Yes, sir, I understand," John replied, feeling a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. "And yet, despite everything I've done for you, I've been hearing complaints about your performance," Anderson continued, his voice growing sharper. "You've missed deadlines, you've made mistakes in the reports, and quite frankly, I don't think you're fit for the job anymore." John's heart pounded in his chest. "Sir, I've been doing my best, but the workload. I don't want excuses." Anderson slammed his fist on the table, causing the pens to rattle. "You're done here, John. Effective immediately." John stood frozen for a moment, the words taking a moment to register. "Wait. Are you firing me?" Anderson smirked. "Yes, I am. You're just not cut out for this." "But..." "The Raisin Tech project," John stammered. "Rachel will handle it." "You're just holding the team back," Anderson interrupted. "Pack your things and leave." John swallowed hard, a mixture of anger and shock bubbling up inside him. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the office, his head spinning. The other employees glanced up as he passed, their faces a mix of sympathy and fear. They had all seen it happen before, Anderson chewing someone up and spitting them out without a second thought. Rachel met him by his desk, her face tight with concern. "What happened?" "He fired me," John whispered, barely able to believe it himself. Rachel's eyes widened. What? He fired you? But you're the only one who understands the financials for the Raisin Tech project. I can't. I know, John said bitterly. But Anderson doesn't care. He thinks I'm replaceable. Rachel shook her head, a heavy silence settling between them. This is going to be a disaster. John glanced back at Anderson's office, where the blinds had been drawn shut. Let him figure that out on his own, John muttered as he grabbed his things and walked out, leaving behind a storm no one could see coming. Rachel stood in the silence, her mind already racing through the ramifications of John's departure. Anderson had no idea what kind of chaos he had just unleashed. Rachel, I need you in my office. Now, Anderson's voice cut through the office yet again, this time with an even sharper edge. Rachel sighed deeply, rubbing her forehead. She had anticipated this moment ever since John had been fired 2 days ago, but the sense of impending doom didn't make it any easier. The Raisin Tech project was already teetering on the edge, and John's sudden departure had only made things worse. She walked into Anderson's office, her folder clutched tightly in her hands. You wanted to see me, Mr. Anderson? Anderson looked up from his computer, his eyes narrowing. I've just been informed that we're missing crucial financial data for the Raisin Tech project. And, surprise, surprise, it's your department that dropped the ball. Rachel stared at him, biting back her frustration. That's because John was handling all the financials. You fired him. Anderson scoffed, leaning back in his chair. Don't tell me you're going to start making excuses for him too. John was incompetent, and you know it. If he couldn't handle the workload, he shouldn't have been here in the first place. I'm not making excuses, Rachel replied, her voice calm but firm. But John was the only one who fully understood the financial intricacies of this project. He'd been managing it from day one, and no one else has the same level of insight. It's going to take weeks, maybe months, to onboard someone new and get them up to speed. Anderson waved his hand dismissively. Nonsense. I've already hired a replacement. Mark Johnson from accounting. He starts tomorrow. Rachel's jaw dropped slightly. Mark? He doesn't have any experience with project management, let alone something as complex as Raisin Tech. Anderson stood up, his face turning red. I don't care. Mark is smart, and he's good with numbers. That's all I need. You'll bring him up to speed, and you'll do it fast. We can't afford any more delays. Rachel took a deep breath, trying to control the rising anger in her chest. This project is an $800,000 investment. It's not just about being good with numbers, Mr. Anderson. We're dealing with intricate financial projections, vendor contracts, licensing fees, and a whole list of moving parts that John kept organized. If we make one mistake, then don't make one, Anderson interrupted coldly. I'm tired of hearing about how irreplaceable John was. If you can't handle this, maybe I'll find someone else who can. Rachel's face flushed, but she forced a nod. I'll do my best, she said, her tone betraying none of the fury bubbling beneath the surface. She turned on her heel and left the office without another word. Back at her desk, Rachel collapsed into her chair, staring blankly at the screen in front of her. She felt trapped. Anderson was blind to the reality of the situation, and it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. Rachel? A voice whispered beside her. It was Steve, one of the lead engineers on the project. He looked around to make sure no one was listening, then leaned in closer. I heard about John. Is it true that Mark from accounting is taking over? Rachel sighed. Yeah. It's a complete mess. Mark knows nothing about what we've been doing. I've been trying to pull together what I can from John's files, but... Steve shook his head. Without John, we're sunk. Half the budget models were in his head. If Anderson thinks we can just plug someone else in, he's delusional. Rachel ran a hand through her hair. Tell me something I don't know. I've been trying to get him to understand, but you know how he is. He refuses to listen to anyone. Steve frowned. What's our next move then? Rachel glanced around the office, lowering her voice. We're going to have to get creative. I've been going through the files John left, but we're missing key projections and data. If we don't get that sorted out soon, we're going to blow through the budget before we even get to the next phase of the project. Steve nodded grimly. We could try reverse engineering some of the data, but it'll take time. Time we don't have. Rachel leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. I know. But Anderson's already breathing down my neck. We've got about a week before the next project review with the board, and if we don't have the numbers in order by then, we're looking at a total collapse. As the hours dragged on, Rachel and her team worked tirelessly, scrambling to reconstruct the financial models John had left behind. But no matter how hard they worked, it became increasingly clear that they were missing too many pieces. The project was spiraling out of control, and with Mark set to start the next day, Rachel knew the situation was about to get even worse. The next morning, Mark arrived at the office, looking nervous and out of place in his new role. Rachel tried her best to brief him, but his lack of experience was immediately apparent. So, I've been looking at the spreadsheets John left behind, Mark said hesitantly, glancing over the documents with furrowed brows. I'm not sure I understand how he was managing all of this. It's pretty complicated. Rachel forced a smile, though inside she was screaming. It's a lot to take in. I'll walk you through it as best as I can, but we're short on time. We need to have everything ready for the board meeting at the end of the week. Mark nodded, clearly overwhelmed. I'll do my best. Rachel spent the entire day trying to bring Mark up to speed, but it quickly became obvious that he was in over his head. The deadlines loomed closer and closer, and with each passing hour, Rachel's anxiety grew. Every time Anderson came by to check on their progress, she could feel the walls closing in. Finally, on the eve of the board meeting, disaster struck. A crucial financial projection, one that John had been working on, turned out to be completely incorrect. The numbers were off by tens of thousands of dollars, throwing the entire budget into disarray. Rachel stared at the error, her heart sinking. There was no time to fix it. The project was doomed. Rachel, Steve said quietly as he stood beside her desk, looking at the chaotic mess on her screen. What are we going to do? Rachel swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the entire company's future on her shoulders. She knew what was coming, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. We're going to watch it all come crashing down. The day of the board meeting arrived, and the atmosphere in the office was tense. People moved quietly, exchanging glances filled with dread. Everyone knew that the Raisin Tech project was teetering on the edge, but no one wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Rachel sat at her desk, staring blankly at the final version of the budget report, which was a far cry from the solid financial plan John had originally designed. Mark's adjustments, though well-intentioned, had created more problems than solutions, and it was too late to undo the damage. Rachel, we need to get going. Anderson's already in the conference room, Steve whispered, standing beside her desk. His voice was calm, but she could sense the same panic bubbling beneath the surface. Rachel nodded, taking a deep breath as she gathered her things. Right. Let's get this over with. As she and Steve walked down the hall, the weight of the upcoming disaster pressed down on her chest like a heavy stone. They reached the door to the conference room, and Rachel hesitated for just a moment before pushing it open. Inside, Anderson sat at the head of the table, his arms crossed, looking unusually smug. The board members were seated around the long table, flipping through the reports that had been sent out the previous evening. Their expressions varied, some seemed confused, others mildly concerned, but none of them knew just how bad things really were. Rachel took her seat next to Anderson, feeling the heat of his gaze on her. Steve sat beside her, his jaw clenched. Mark was across the table, nervously fiddling with his pen, clearly dreading what was about to unfold. All right, let's get started, Anderson began, his tone sharp and businesslike. As you all know, the Raisin Tech project has been one of our largest investments this year. We've put $800,000 into this, and we're expecting significant returns by the end of the next quarter. Rachel, why don't you walk the board through where we stand? Rachel swallowed hard, her mouth dry. She glanced at the report in front of her, knowing full well that what she was about to present was a disaster in the making. There was no hiding it. Thank you, Mr. Anderson, she began, her voice steady but tight. As you all know, the Raisin Tech project is a multi-phase development with a lot of moving parts. Initially, we had projected that by this point, we'd be well into the second phase of development. However, we've encountered several delays, most notably in the financial modeling, which has put us behind schedule. A few board members exchanged glances, frowns deepening across their faces. Delays? Mr. Miller, one of the senior board members, asked. What kind of delays are we talking about? Rachel braced herself. Primarily related to the budgeting and vendor contracts. Unfortunately, after John, our previous financial manager, left the company, we've struggled to fill the gap. Despite the team's best efforts, we've fallen short of the original projections. As a result, we are now facing a significant budget shortfall. The room fell silent for a moment as the board members processed her words. How significant are we talking? Mr. Miller pressed, his eyes narrowing. Rachel glanced at the papers in front of her. We're currently off by roughly $250,000. And if we continue at this rate without additional resources, we may not be able to complete the second phase within the remaining budget. A stunned silence filled the room. Anderson, who had been sitting quietly until now, shot Rachel a sharp look. His jaw clenched, but before he could speak, Mr. Harper, another board member, leaned forward. Wait, how did this happen? We were under the impression that this project was under control. $250,000 is not a minor discrepancy. John was managing most of the financial aspects of the project, Rachel explained, trying to keep her voice calm. When he left, we lost a lot of the foundational work he had done. His replacement, Mark, has been doing his best, but without the time to properly transition and understand the full scope of the project, we've had difficulties reconciling the financials. Mr. Harper turned to Anderson, his expression growing more incredulous by the second. Anderson, how could this have been allowed to happen? Didn't you realize how integral John was to this project? Anderson's face reddened, but he kept his voice cold and dismissive. John was incompetent. He was behind on deadlines and constantly made mistakes. I fired him because we couldn't afford to have someone like that jeopardizing the project. Fired him? Mr. Miller repeated, his voice sharp with disbelief. You fired the only person who understood the financials of an $800,000 project? Anderson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but his arrogance was unshaken. John was replaceable. Mark here has taken over, and I believe that with time, we can get things back on track. The board members exchanged looks, their skepticism clear. And yet, Mr. Harper said, his voice tight, we're now $250,000 over budget, with no clear plan on how to recover. This doesn't sound like something that's under control, Anderson. It sounds like a catastrophe. Rachel could feel the tension rising in the room. Anderson's face hardened as he stared at the board, his pride now on the line. It's not a catastrophe. We can still salvage this. We just need to adjust the timeline and reallocate resources. Steve, who had been quietly watching the exchange, finally spoke up, his voice low but steady. It's not that simple, Mr. Anderson. The financial models John built were based on very specific data points. We don't have access to all of those anymore. And unless we bring in someone with the same level of experience, the project will continue to fall apart. We're losing ground every day. The room fell silent once again, and this time, Anderson had no quick retort. The reality of the situation was sinking in, not just for the board, but for him as well. Mr. Miller leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. So let me get this straight. You fired the key person managing this project, brought in someone with no experience, and now you expect us to just wait while you figure things out? This is an $800,000 investment. We can't afford to lose that kind of money on poor decisions and mismanagement. Anderson's face turned a deeper shade of red, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his chair. I can fix this. We can fix this. I'll bring in outside consultants if I have to. Too little, too late, Mr. Harper said, shaking his head. This project was supposed to deliver results, not excuses. Rachel could see Anderson's facade cracking, his arrogance slowly being peeled away in front of everyone. For once, he had no one else to blame but himself. We'll need to discuss next steps, Mr. Miller said, his voice grim. But as far as I'm concerned, this project is already off the rails. As the board members began to gather their things, Anderson remained seated, staring down at the table. His eyes flicked toward Rachel, filled with resentment, as though somehow this was her fault. But she knew better. Everyone in that room knew better. Rachel stood, gathering her own papers. As she turned to leave, Anderson's voice, low and strained, stopped her. You could have told me, he muttered bitterly. She turned back, meeting his gaze. I did, she replied evenly, but you didn't listen. And with that, Rachel walked out of the room, the weight of the disaster no longer hers to carry. Behind her, the wreckage of Anderson's arrogance lay scattered, with no one left to pick up the pieces but him.